This fundamental video will be about drawing heads. Heads in general aren't really an art fundamental, but many artists focus on drawing heads, so I thought I would make a separate video about them. Hi, here's May, and I already made an anatomy video, but there I didn't really talk about the head since I really wanted it to be separate. I also already made some face tutorials, but there I was really focusing on drawing them the way I draw them, in more of a stylized anime style, and changing up the proportions for stylized heads like this. But today, just like in my other fundamental videos, I will first start with breaking the whole head down and finding an approach to draw it in a more general way. So let's start with the basics and my own way of breaking it down. If you really want to draw heads well, it's very good to study skulls at first. From studying skulls, the most important thing I took away was the importance of the eye socket, and that the eyes are inset in the face. Also how the cheekbones work, and that the lower jaw hinges from eye point and doesn't just move up and down. You can also recognize this when you look at yourself talking in the mirror. You will see that your whole mouth doesn't just move down and up when you're drawing faces where the mouth is open. It's good to pay attention to this. Now let's get on to redrawing the head. For this, it can be very helpful to first map out the placement of the features and the general head shape. It all starts out with a circle or a sphere. You want to imagine this to be a guide for the whole head in 3D. There are lots of different tutorials out there. For almost all of them you will see a vertical guideline and a horizontal or multiple horizontal ones. As a base to draw the head, I would recommend going with a sphere with guidelines around it in the proper perspective. How do you determine where you want to place the guidelines? I'm now gonna give you 2 examples of how you could use guidelines. For one, we have a very simplified approach where, other than the vertical guideline, you would only use one horizontal guideline for the eyes. But what makes more sense to me is to use multiple ones, and for this I would place one line at the jaw, at the nose end, at the upper part of the eyes or the eyebrows, and at the hairline, and also at the upper end of the head, and they all have the same distance. This was the same for all the different tutorials I watched. From this I took away that these are in general the proportions that will lead to just draw aesthetically pleasing faces. If you want to have more realistic proportions, you can of course also make the hairline to head distance be smaller, meaning the whole features would be higher up on the face. In general, you can shift the lower 3 guidelines depending on how far down on the face you want the eyes and everything to be. For anime faces, you can make the distance from the upper head end to the hairline even bigger. You will just recognize that for anime faces you will have alien-like heads. And the way you draw the jaw can be very different stylistically, depending on what you prefer. It can be more rounded or sharp, or you can have a pointy or wider chin. If you're unsure about what you want to use here, you can look up references and what you like to see. And I talk more about all kinds of variations in this other video of stylizing different kinds of anime faces. And you might have heard of the Loomis method to construct heads, and something I took from this is to make a circle at the side of the head. Where would you place the circle? It would be from the nose end to the upper eye end, so that in the middle the upper eye line would go through it. And it also makes sure that your horizontal guidelines in general curve around the head and aren't just straight. For the features, after mapping them out with the guidelines, you can draw them. Similar to the anatomy tutorial video, starting with the general head, just like I started with the general body, and will then move on to the features, similar to the parts of the body. I will also mention that for the side profile, if you go for a more realistic look, you will have the jaw, the eyebrow line or the forehead all lining up as a basis. This can of course change a bit for different faces, and the same applies for more stylized heads, but you will often see that the nose is very protruding forward. When you're going for a more realistic head, the ears will be at around a 2/3 distance from the front, while for more stylized anime heads, they will be at around half of the head. I'll now go over the different features, but since we have a few to go through and I don't want this video to be too long, I will go over the most basic tips and will make more detailed videos for the eyes and the hair, since I watched lots of videos for these two, and they are often what really draws a viewer in for character illustrations. For the features, just like with the heads, you can go for a more realistic or stylized look depending on what you like. Now let's start with the eyes. Generally, the shape they have will be that the upper eye shape will be split in 3 parts and the lower eye shape into 2 parts. It's very important to make sure the eyes are in the correct perspective, and when you have the head turning to the side, making sure that the eye that's facing away is getting smaller and so on. And also when the head is looking up, they curve upward, for example. This is also true for the other features, of course, but I mention it here since for the eyes it's most relevant. For placing the eyes, there will always be a distance of one eye between both of them. And for the iris, you can directly draw a circle shape, which will be partly covered by the eyelid, depending on how wide the eyes open. Yeah, this was just a very short form of tips for drawing eyes. Then for the nose, this can also be very different depending on if you're going for a more realistic or stylized look. And almost all of the time you will have some indication at the lower end of the nose. I'm giving you 2 examples here. For a realistic, you could have the nose bridge, 2 planes on the outside, and this nose end ball shape, also portraying the nostrils a bit. While for a stylized anime style, you could use just one line of showing the end of the nose. Now for the mouth, the most common way to portray it is to just use a line. But if you want to, you can of course indicate lips as well through a line under the mouth or also one above. You can also of course portray it by using coloring later on. For realistic lips, what's also good to keep in mind is that they have this cupid bow shape for the upper lip. You could also just use a line for this. Now we move on to the ears, and here is how I would draw them from the front and the side, and it's a bit different from how realistic ears look, but for ears you really don't have to make all the lines be anatomically correct. You can just go with something that works for you. And now, after talking about drawing the head with the features, let's go on to the most helpful tips I got from watching all the videos. First, from pt.6, it's to draw the head connected to the neck. And from him I also got a tip that the jaw hinges and that the ears are not placed straight on the head, but at an angle. Then a tip for drawing eyes, it's to draw the eye shape before drawing the eye with lashes. From Josh, I got the tip that you can use this kind of triangle to help placing the facial features, and also reference cats for drawing cuter faces, especially when you're looking at Disney characters. You can recognize this. From Blue Biscuits, something I found very helpful was to keep in mind that the face isn't a flat mask and has angles. In the video, the face is simplified using a mask, but then later on there's also a head portrayed with different planes, which I found very helpful. It looks more 3D and not as flat, dependent on the style you draw. When you simplify it, it's also okay to have the face look more flat. Especially for the eyes, using more detailed guidelines around the head to make sure even the lashes are aligned can be very helpful. It's important to get the eyes to look good since it's what the viewer pays attention to a lot. However, I also got this tip from Naoki Saito: distortion can be attractive, meaning you don't always need complete symmetry when drawing faces, and one eye could be a bit wider open than the other one, for example. And I now demonstrate also a simple guide to expressions. For a neutral expression, it's more of a straight horizontal line. For a happy one, you would have this upwards curve. For a sad one, downwards curve. And for the angry expression, you would have this tension of everything going together. While for a surprised face, it's the opposite again. Everything would go kind of outward. The whole face would really expand. Now for some exercises you can do. First, you can take references and trace over them at first, and then draw them separately with the same proportions, or you can change up the proportions a bit if you want to. Then you can draw heads at different angles. You can also do skull studies, and it's best to add ears and the neck here. You don't have to be detailed, but this is more so you can have the general form of skeleton heads in mind. Then another exercise would be to take a head angle you want to draw and draw it multiple times. You can also change up the features and the proportions each time if you want to. You could, for example, first draw something more realistic and then try to stylize it in different ways. Or you might want to stay in one style and change it up slightly to kind of resemble different characters when you're drawing the heads. And finally, you could draw the same character with the same proportions and features from different angles. Lastly, I'll move on to recommending some videos. Let's go more into detail on different topics, and you can check them out depending on what you want to learn more about. First, from pt.6, he has lots of videos about, for example, skulls, noses, ears, eyes, or the mouth. And these videos are really good for anatomy, to get the general idea of the facial feature down, and it definitely helps with drawing realistic but also stylized heads. Then for QR bits, I can recommend this video that is about drawing faces in perspective. From this video I really learned about the importance of the ears when drawing heads at different angles. And then from Marc Brunet, I found that his video was good as a basic guide for constructing the head. And as I mentioned before, from Blue Biscuits, I really like the video for visualizing the planes of the head and making use of this for lighting. If you want to know more about drawing expressions, I can recommend the videos from Tonico Pantoja. which explain them in more detail. Finally, I will also mention some videos that are about drawing eyes specifically. We first have one from Santiago Astor, which is very good for realistic eyes, also drawing them in perspective. Then for anime eyes, I found the tutorial from De Cecile to be very helpful in general for drawing them, and then for stylizing them and exploring different options drawing eyes, I found the videos from Fuchsia Paint and Dongchan very useful. This brings me to the end of this head tutorial video. I hope you now have a good idea about how you can draw heads and what you can look out for or which methods you can use. If you have any other exercises for drawing heads or things that really help you with them, you can also leave that in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a nice day. Goodbye.